Hello and welcome to today's class. Today we will do the chapter The Address by Margo Minco. Before we move to the plot of the story, let's quickly look at the backdrop of the story. The story, The Address, is set during the Second World War, where the Germans, the Nazis under Hitler, invaded Holland. And in Holland, 90% of them were Jews. These Nazis attacked and persecuted the Jews. Jews fled to other countries. Many of them were imprisoned in concentration camps. If you look at the picture here, this is just a comparison of Holland before the World War and after the World War. The massive devastation that it underwent during the Second World War can be clearly seen from the picture. And this story is a very touching story of a girl, a daughter, and how she is suffering emotionally, personally, during the Second World War when the Jews were persecuted, how she lost her mother, how she lost her house, her belongings, and everything, and how her life changed completely after the war. We'll quickly discuss a few important events in the story. The first important event is the narrator's visit to Mrs. Darling. The story begins with the narrator coming back to her country after the war was over, and she wanted to see a woman named Mrs. Darling. The narrator goes to the house and she tells the lady that she was the daughter of Mrs. S and she had come to take her mother's belonging. The lady, Mrs. Darling, she opens the door and she's very surprised to see the narrator, and she hides herself behind the door, denying knowing anybody by the name of Mrs. S. And the narrator also, for a moment, believes that probably she had come to a wrong address. But when she notices that the lady was wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan, she became sure that she had come to the right place. The lady, when she saw that the narrator was looking at a cardigan, she hid herself partially behind the door. And when the narrator asked her about her mother, she said that she thought that none of the people would come back after the war. The lady closes the door on the narrator, asking her to come back some other time. The narrator leaves to go back to the station. On her way back, she remembers her past. She remembers how, when she had come in the first half of the war, she saw many things missing in the house. On asking her mother had told that Mrs. Darling, who was an old acquaintance of hers, was kind enough to take all the valuables with her. She would keep them safely in a house so that if they had to leave the country during the war, their valuable things would be kept safely with Mrs. Darling, and she had also promised to return them when they came back. The narrator got a glimpse of Mrs. Darling when she was moving out of the house carrying a heavy suitcase, and the mother of the narrator had given the address of Mrs. Darling, which was number 46 Marconi Street. After the war, when the narrator came back to the country, she was not interested in getting back the things. And she was even afraid of going back to those things. She was scared of facing the things that belonged to her mother, because it would remind her of a time that is no more, because her mother is dead. That beautiful country is no more, and she's been through horrifying experiences. She felt that these things would just evoke painful memories. But as time passed, everything was becoming more normal again, like the earlier time. And then the narrator also adjusted to a new life, and somehow she started becoming curious as to where all the belongings of her mother would be. And she wanted to go back to that address, she wanted to touch them, see them, recall all the memories that were associated with them. After her first futile visit to Mrs. Darling's house, the narrator decides to try a second time. This time, a girl of about 15 opened the door and let her in. Her mother was not at home. The narrator followed the girl along the passage. She noticed an old fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder that the narrator's family had never used, and it was more bulky than a single candlestick. The narrator feels very disgusted to see her mother's belongings used and arranged in a very tasteless and callous manner. She realizes that those things were important to her as they were associated with her mother and their past life. Now, disconnected from them and being used so tastelessly and callously, these things were no more valuable for her. She leaves without meeting Mrs. Darling or taking her mother's belongings, and she feels that she is very happy living in a small rented room, and there's no more space for all these things in a small rented apartment, so it's of no value for her. The narrator just leaves the house of Mrs. Darling, and she feels it's better to forget the past and forget the address. She has so much to forget. She has to forget all the horrifying things in the past. She has to forget the loss of a mother. And she feels, compared to all the other things that she has to forget, forgetting the address of Mrs. Darling would be the easiest. The story, the address, it presents the human dilemma that follows war or when you lose a loved one. This very beautifully presents the psychological uh, problems that people face when they undergo a war situation. The story has very beautifully brought about an emotional account of a doctor who goes in search of a mother's belonging after the war and when the mother is dead. And this happens in Holland when, after the Jewish persecution, when everything becomes normal, people are getting back to normalcy, but it cannot be the life which they had before the war, because they have lost their houses, they have lost their loved ones, they have lost their belongings, they have lost a part of their identity as well. In this story also we see how the daughter goes back to get the things from Mrs. Darling, but when she sees the things and she sees that how they were being used by Mrs. Darling, they don't hold any more value for her, and she decides to forget them and move ahead in life. And the girl's decision to move ahead, it gives a very optimistic uh, twist to the story, that she's ready not just to forget everything that happened with them, but she's going to forget even the past which is haunting, which is painful for her. Go through the questions that follow in order to test your comprehension and understanding of the text. Thank you for staying connected. I hope you have understood the chapter, the address, and also been able to answer the questions.